Okay, so I have added my obligatory how did I get here slide. I'm doing it spatially, even though we demographers aren't spatial. This is the gridded population of the world data set, which I was deeply involved with for the better part of a decade in revising, developing, and so forth. So I had got my bachelor's and master's in public policy at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, studying basically international relations and very interested in development in particular. From there I went off and worked in Bangladesh doing public health kinds of program evaluation, cost benefit analyses kinds of things. Bangladesh, as for everybody here who's been there, you know it's a place where there are all sorts of interesting social and climatic issues, and they are unavoidable from the get-go. And lots of climate variability, let alone climate change. No, landing an airplane is like landing on a lace doily. So, so even as an observer there, before pre-reorientation toward global environmental change and climate change issues, I was off in Bangladesh and getting firsthand experience thinking through some of these issues. It floods there every year, for example. I then went to Berkeley and did a PhD in demography, which is, there aren't all that many of them in the country. Michael, who had left yesterday, actually was at Berkeley, and he was involved in revising the discipline. The discipline now you can get a PhD in demography, but you also can get one with demography and sociology and so forth. So we demographers are kind of a strict, those of us with PhDs in demography are a pretty rare breed. That led me to doing a postdoc back in Ann Arbor, again still focusing on more social issues. And then that took me to Hawaii, to the East-West Center, where I focused a lot of my work on Asia, still thematically in social demography. At which point the East-West Center was losing a lot of its federal funding, and I went to look for an academic job. And because I had this unusual degree, I found myself taking a position at CSIN, at the Center for International Earth Science and Information Network in New York, to work on bringing demography into global environmental change. And that was the transitional moment by which I became no longer just a social demographer, but one doing much more interdisciplinary work. So I ended up at CSIN, and I was there for 8 years, and I loved being there. They produce wonderful data sets. That is one of them. This is another. But subsequent to that, I left to go back into academia at the City University of New York when they were developing a demography institute, partly so I could continue to make this translation back from bringing demography into global change back to bringing global change back to demography. And so that's my sort of circular route into this, circular and serendipitous route into this community. Now, I do want to very briefly go through a few of my priors. I'm going to go through them really quickly, but population growth, as seen by most demographers, including myself, is not the problem with respect to climate emissions. At least if it is, it's a gross oversimplification. Wealth and industrial economies, those are much more likely to be the problem rather than population growth per se. So we have to look in our own backyards well before we go and blame, high growth rates in Africa and Asia for the problem. Though that is not to say that we shouldn't distribute and have wonderful family planning programs throughout the world for everybody who has the need for contraception and wishes to lower their fertility, for example. And there is still a lot of that. I'll get to this point in the future. I'll come back to that point in a minute. But economic growth, I think, is also important. It is not the evil here. It actually allows countries to become more democratized, more educated. Education lowers fertility rates in and of itself. Education causes people to adopt behaviors that typically are environmentally friendly, and so on and so forth, and to insist on governance institutions that are more democratic in nature. And therefore, development I do not see as the foe, but as a friend as at least paradigmatically. I'm just very briefly, the link from science to society, I've heard a lot about it. I hope some of the afternoon discussions have on this. I think that most social scientists do not see themselves as understanding decision making. They understand behavior, and that's quite a bit different from understanding decision making. They might understand individual choice in a particular setting, like a home, a family, or a firm, but not full institutional processes, although some do study institutions. But I do think those institutions really matter, and that is an unmet need even within the community that I'm in. I also this has not come up, but I should alert everybody in this room, if you don't know it, that if the climate community needs demographic data and the demographic community can't supply it, the climate community does not feel shy about creating it themselves, warts and all. This has happened many times in the past. It happens less now, but I think it's a caveat that needs to be identified, and to the extent it needs to be, we need to put our brakes on that, because there is a lot of information and insight that will come from engagement with that community. But I could give a lot of anecdotes, but in the interest of time, I will not. And lastly, I just want to, I think, again, we should have more global, local linkages and discussions within this context. I think the global piece and the developing country piece is really significant, and sometimes gets put aside because of our things in our own backyard. So let me tell you some demographic truths. Tom just started them. The future world is irreversibly urban. One of the things, being a demographer, we use momentum as a big part of our discipline. The bulk of the future growth will take place in cities and towns, and actually just the cities and towns of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The future world is also increasingly aging. Not a topic I've heard much about here, but it's really true. We can look around this room, although we're a self-selected bunch, and we could use that. And by aging, this is England. I'm including myself in this group. So, but here we have, this is a population pyramid, a very simple device that's used, and this just shows the men and women. And as we age, you know, there's a lot of momentum behind this, so we'll see this little bubble again in the future, but what we're going to see is more and more people in these upper age distributions. And that's something, there are a lot of reasons we should care about that. I'll give a few examples later. And so some of the implications for climate change I'll get to in a minute. I'm going to very briefly tell you why today's urbanization differs from the past. We have urban giganticism. Tom made reference to that a little bit by just saying, well, what if all of our future growth is in big cities? It won't all be in big cities, but we do have giants. We now really have to struggle with the notion of, I'm not going to talk about urban definitions. What is a city? What is urbanization? I spend a lot of time thinking about this problem. Patty, I think, is going to mention it a little bit. I'm happy to discuss it. It just doesn't get part of my real estate now. But the old world of seeing the world as only urban or rural over there versus seeing it as a suite of continuum and agglomeration, this change is readily happening, and data, new forms of data are allowing us to make this possible as well. And new ways of thinking about what is the city is all fostering that change. And that has real implications also for how we think about climate adaptation and emissions reductions. These cities are not as dense as they don't have entirely the same economies of scales that we might have seen in the past. Migration to cities is largely from other cities and towns. It's not rural to urban anymore. It's city or town to urban. Again, also important. And much variation in the urban demographic profile. Cities are more varied now than they used to be, I would argue. So this is just the picture of giganticism, where you have, this is developing country, and we have all these in Asia. Well, this is largely driven by Asia. These are cities of 1 million or more. These are cities of 10 million or more, but there are far more of them in the developing world, or will be, than there are in the more developed world. Where are those giants? They are lots of them are in India and China. India and China has a lot of them. This is some of my own work. This shows a spatial rendering of cities by their population size with aridity zones and a low elevation climate zone, which is derived from combining population data. The population data is derived from combining satellite data with census data. How are they going to grow? Well, this is ongoing work of mine. It's an econometric model. It uses Bayesian estimators. That means we can say a lot about the uncertainty of this growth rate. The findings that we have from this study, again, I won't talk much about it, but I can no longer show them in their spatial by their urban extents, because these extents, I don't have, when I produced this, I did not have an historic time series or enough information to guess on the spatial expansion or contraction of cities. Now, going forward, this is part of new work, we are looking at this. But this does show us that India, for example, alone, by 2050, we expect we'll have 4 cities that are over 20 million persons, 3 of which are coastal. They're not in the dry lands. And then they have another 11 cities of 5 million or more, all of which are either in arid or coastal areas. I mean, India, most land is either arid or coastal in India anyway, but some of them are pretty hyper-arid, or not hyper-arid, but with increasing aridity stress. The other thing I should point out is in our model, unlike all the data you can get about cities from the United Nations, in the work that we've been doing, we include demographic indicators on city growth, and we know at least that city growth is largely driven by fertility. So if you want to lower the growth of cities, You really do want strong public health infrastructure and the delivery of family planning services and increasing education and other kinds of things. However, my model omits migration because those data are much harder to process. We're in the process of doing that. This is also more generally applicable to understanding climate change migration because we really understand very little about migration. I'll return to that in a minute. And again, satellite information will help a lot to understand how cities will grow. These are the growth rates of those cities. So just want to point out that small cities are important. Over here we have, these are gigantic cities, like over 10 million. So, and about between over 10 million and 5 million to 10 million are about a quarter of all cities. But another quarter of the cities of the world are between 100,000 and 500,000. So they're small. And you might notice what's missing from this is any town below 100,000 persons, and we're spending this lovely time here in Aspen. Aspen, I understand, calls itself the city of Aspen. Is Aspen urban? Everybody here, I'm sure, believes they're an urbanite, but they've flown in or driven in from some farther place. Anyhow, small towns are definitely not in this. And so if small towns have urban behaviors or exchange people, they're omitted completely from this picture. If they're if they're satellite cities on the edges of larger cities or suburbs, they may be omitted from this. They may or may not, depending upon how they're classified. This tells us that most cities, I gave you the upshot of that. That's Africa. Even in Africa, most migration is between cities and towns, not from rural areas. So here are a few things we don't know. We do not know where that city growth will occur. The forecasts of cities are currently non-spatial, and the official ones, meaning the ones that most people use that come out of the UN, are ademographic. They are just simple extrapolations. There are known problems with that methodology, but they don't have the capacity to revise it. They're interested in revising it. It's a big deal to revise it. People don't read the fine notes on the back, so they use the data anyway. So we don't know where will the growth occur on the periphery of cities? Will it occur vertically in new cities, in slums? We don't really know much about the causes of city growth. I have found that fertility causes city growth, that large cities grow less rapidly than small cities, but we don't know we don't know the contribution, for example, of migration. We don't know much about the composition of city growth, particularly of the poor. And we don't know where precisely those climate change impacts will occur. And this is a problem of the climate modeling more than of the flood modeling more than on the demographic side, because the resolution of those data do not really permit us to say so much about cities in a systematic way. We might know a lot for a given city, but we don't know a lot across all cities. So I want to very quickly show some contributions of the demographic contributions to climate change research. There have been 3 areas in emissions, in adaptation, and populations at risk and vulnerability. And then lastly, on a lot of either local or regional scale work that's largely land use, a lot on Amazonia, some in Thailand, some in the Great Plains of the US. That I'm not going to talk about. A lot of that is looked at land use change and migration and in household strategies. Lots of work on that. Very, very good. Much more local scale. Patty's going to give us a little flavor of some of that too, I believe. But I'm going to talk about the first 2. This is a model. It's based on NCAR work from my colleague Brian O'Neill. Brian and Brian's team and my team have currently a project to compare the 2 pieces of work you'll sort of see together currently. But aging, which we just saw, and urbanization, the 2 most important demographic phenomena of the 21st century, can have these pathways through which they influence emissions. And we find this is the result of his modeling. And it shows that aging will lower emissions, currently lowers emissions, and will continue to lower emissions in the future. But urbanization, which is really its impact through labor, will raise emissions. So that's one result, and this needs much refinement because it was done with fairly coarse indicators. Then another project that came out of NCAR, Brian Jones, who was in that lab and is now a postdoc with me, downscaled some of this data. This is consistent, I think, with the A2 scenario, and it shows the population distribution, because if you want to do adaptation, you need to know a little bit about where people are. And this is an example of showing the NCAR model, this versus several other models for the US on where on the population, the likely population at proximal to sea level rise or to coast in Florida. So, and their model's right in the middle. So In my work, well, I've done a lot of work on populations at risk. These are the materials that go into it. You start with the finest administrative boundaries you can get your hands on. You look at you take urban extent through satellite measurement. You create a low elevation coastal zone, also from this is from SRTM data. Largely, we did 10 meters because it was the best we could do at the time. We've refined it. Subsequent to that, that's a close-up, and then you grid all the data, and you do this simple little raster like zonal statistic in GIS, and that lets you produce little output like this, which tells us that the number of persons living in this at seaward hazard in this low elevation coastal zone, we find that globally more than 600. This is in the year 2000. 600 million persons, 1 out of every 10 lives in the low elevation coastal zone, but 1 out of every urban dweller lives in that zone. So cities are most definitely at higher risk. And that big orange part of the pie there is Asia. So we really need to pay attention to Asia. Then you can produce tabular estimates of the same stuff. This is a refinement of those data sets for Bangladesh and Vietnam, looking at different coastal scenarios now that we have better low elevation estimates. And you can also produce city-specific stuff, and this shows, this is country, but we can also produce it for cities. And again, of the 180 countries that have that have any of their territory in the low elevation coastal zones, about 70% of them have their largest city in that zone. So now resolution matters. This is Vietnam. If you use coarse inputs, you get about 25% or 12 million persons too few as being at risk. There's a real tendency to use these coarse inputs because they're the ones that are available without a lot of effort or without a lot of money. A lot of the times these data are proprietary. That is changing, but it's changing slowly. So I won't spend more time on this. This is an example of taking those data and using them with hydrological model to look at urban water shortage, and again, Asia comes up very clear. So I have some ideas about, I know I have 2 minutes, so why engagement in the social sciences is limited. The methods and material are largely aspatial. Climate is seen as outside the domain. That some of the issues that were raised yesterday about credentialism and getting tenure, those are also issues. But demography, for example, is already an interdisciplinary field. When you add on additional interdisciplinariness to it, it raises the bar more than can usually be crammed into a PhD program. But I think the times are changing. Before I get to that, and I know I only have 2 minutes, I think the methods are quite a bit different between the approaches within the natural and social sciences. And what's seen as causal pathways assessments themselves are sometimes seen as suspicious within this part of the social science community. And statistical generalizability and representative are really important. And that leads to this kind of demographic data collection, which is national censuses and surveys. And surveys do not lend themselves, nationally representative surveys do not lend themselves very well to certainly place-based analysis. They may contribute to a larger national dialogue, but they are not place-based. Even when you have coordinates like geospatial coordinates of the survey clusters. And again, another topic that could be expanded, but it's really important to understand the way these disciplines approach their craft, I think, to help make better connections. Migration is very poorly studied, even in the demographic community. And as was Tom said, urban is considered a strata rather than a core behavior like fertility, mortality, migration, marriage, etc. So this makes it really challenging to be compatible with climate data, for example. Climate data tend to be spatially explicit. Demographic data are not always. But the types of spatial explicitness are sometimes not usable. Then the linkages have to be done spatially. If your demographic data are not spatial or in much different representative worlds, you might coarsen out your phenomena. Then temporally, that's another issue. Demographic and social science data tend to be collected even at larger, not ongoing, but like every decade, for example. And also, social scientists typically do not work in grid space, and they like to have names of something associated, like administrative names or units attached to them that are recognizable. This is really fundamentally to that discipline. So I know my thing is going off. This is some evidence of progress. So a congressional briefing and Nature Climate Change article on why urbanization is important that's focused on the work that Brian O'Neill and I have done. Even the president of the PAA the Population Association of America, said, well, we've survived the population bomb, but climate change may actually challenge that. So it's not population growth, but thinking about this externality of climate change. So then this was already a couple years ago. So doctoral student topics are really coming along, and a lot of transnational data. Can I make an inequality point? I would like inequality to come on this agenda. So here's a slide on it. I won't say it, but inequality between production and the climate change hazards will be born where they were not produced, and I think that's a part of the conversation that has to be had as well. So I will end. Oh wait, I'll end with my picture, which I was encouraged to.
Thanks,
my
Deborah.
local your pond.
Deborah. Thank you. Yeah.